to do something a bit different for this week's video. And this week's email is very much talking about space and what space we have within the joint and within the body to be able to move in. Because we only really need the amount of space we need to be able to move. We don't necessarily need too much more space, because then if we've got more space or a lot more space, the body has to work out how it's going to control that space and use that space and actually have connection through to that space. And a great way of being able to look at how much space the body has to use is a single leg raise. And it's one of those exercises or one of those movements that can be used for so many different purposes, and also can be used to think about stretching of our hamstrings. And I have that pause when I talk, because if you also follow me for quite a while, I'm not a great fan of stretching, to say the least. And stretching hamstrings, they often feel that we actually need more control and shortening and strengthening of our hamstrings rather than the stretching of the hamstrings, but that's a whole nother story. So coming back to the single leg raise and thinking about space that we have to be able to move into. The way that I like to set up this is actually against the wall, and I actually haven't checked whether I actually have space to actually be able to do this. Coming into a comfortable position onto the back and then popping the feet onto the wall, provided that feels just really nice and comfortable. With the feet then onto the wall, you can find the connection of the feet. So you've got that inside pad just below the big toe, the outside pad, and then that centre point of the heel. We're going to have the working leg that's going to be assessed, and then our other leg that's just going to be resting there. However, our resting leg is also wanting to be straight. As soon as we notice that there's any movement through that resting leg, then kind of that's our assessment over, that's the assessment done. Our working leg, we're going to try and keep the toes up vertical or kind of in that straight line as much as possible, and that knee nice and locked out. And then the rest of the body is going to stay in that exact same position, and then it'll be then lifting, then that leg up towards the ceiling. That knee is still going to stay locked out, and then we come to then see how much space there is. If when we start to come up, that knee starts to bend, or the opposite one starts to lift up off the ground, then that is where we are with this assessment. And we're very much assessing how much hip flexion, a true honest hip flexion, we have. And this is an active range, so it's how much I can lift the leg up, rather than our passive range, which will be kind of assisting ourselves further. Because then the difference between our active and our passive is that our active is our usable space, and our passive is kind of a bit useless because we haven't actually got any control over that space. So that is our single leg, straight leg hip flexion test, because the hip flexion just gives us so much information as to what's happening through the hip, because we need to be able to internally rotate and externally rotate our femur, so that bone inside our thigh within our hip socket. But we also need to be able to have some tiny amount of movement through our pelvis. As that leg comes up into hip flexion, our pelvis also, the innominate, these kind of wingy bits on our pelvis also need to be able to move ever so slightly. And our sacrum, this bone at the back here, which is part of our spine, also has an ability to move. So have a play around with your single leg, straight leg hip flexion test. And just start to have a play around and feel how that feels through your body, and what things you notice moving, and maybe even the difference between your passive space and your active space. Message me back, see what you find, and let me know how you get on. Enjoy!